The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as Sergeant Elena Vasquez adjusted her scope for the third time in 10 minutes. Something felt wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but 23 years of military service had taught her to trust that gnawing feeling in her gut. The birds had stopped singing an hour ago, and the usual chatter from the nearby village had gone silent. These weren't good signs. Elena lay flat on her belly atop a ridge overlooking the valley below, where her battalion was scheduled to pass through in less than 2 hours. The 2nd Infantry Battalion was returning from a successful mission deep in enemy territory, and everyone was eager to get back to base. But Elena had volunteered to scout ahead, claiming she wanted to ensure the route was clear. In reality, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her radio crackled softly beside her. "Raven's Nest, this is Eagle Base. What's your status?" came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, the battalion commander. Elena keyed her radio quietly. "Eagle Base, Raven's Nest. All clear from my position. No movement detected." She paused, then added, "Sir, I'm seeing some unusual patterns in the terrain. Request permission to hold position for extended observation." There was a brief silence before Martinez responded. "Negative, Raven's Nest. Battalion is moving on schedule. Return to formation immediately." "That's an order." Elena stared at her radio for a long moment. She had been given a direct order to abandon her position and rejoin the battalion. Any soldier worth their rank knew that disobeying a direct order could result in court-martial, especially during active operations. But something deep inside her screamed that the valley below was a trap. She had earned the nickname Avenger 3 years ago during her first deployment in this region. Her unit had been ambushed, and she had watched helplessly as her best friend, Corporal Sarah Chun, was killed by enemy fire. Elena had spent the next 18 hours tracking down the sniper responsible, eliminating him and his entire support team. The name stuck, but Elena never felt proud of it. It reminded her too much of what she had lost. Now, lying on this ridge with her M24 sniper rifle, Elena felt that same cold certainty she had experienced that day. The enemy was out there, waiting. She could feel their eyes on the valley, could sense their patience as they prepared to spring their trap on the unsuspecting battalion below. Through her scope, Elena began a methodical scan of the valley floor. The route her battalion would take was a narrow dirt road that wound between 2 steep hills covered in dense vegetation. It was the only practical path for vehicles, which made it an ideal location for an ambush. Any enemy force positioned on those hillsides would have a perfect field of fire on the entire convoy. As she studied the terrain more carefully, Elena began to notice subtle signs that confirmed her worst fears. There were patches of disturbed earth on the hillsides that didn't match the natural vegetation patterns. Several bushes appeared to have been recently transplanted, their root systems still showing loose soil around the base. Most telling of all, she spotted what looked like the glint of metal reflecting sunlight from 3 different positions on the eastern hillside. Elena's heart rate increased as she realized the scope of what she was seeing. This wasn't just a simple ambush. The enemy had been preparing this position for weeks, possibly months. They had created carefully camouflaged fighting positions that would be virtually invisible to a passing convoy. Her battalion would drive straight into a killing field without ever knowing what hit them. She keyed her radio again, her voice urgent but controlled. "Eagle Base, Raven's Nest. I have eyes on possible enemy positions in the valley. Multiple concealed fighting positions detected. Recommend immediate halt of convoy movement." The response was swift and angry. "Raven's Nest, you are out of position and seeing shadows. Return to formation immediately. We have air reconnaissance that shows the valley is clear. Do not delay the convoy with false reports." Elena gritted her teeth in frustration. She knew what she was seeing, but convincing her commanding officer over the radio was proving impossible. Air reconnaissance from high altitude would never spot the carefully concealed positions she had identified. The enemy had done their homework too well. She had a choice to make, and she had to make it fast. She could follow orders, abandon her position, and hope that her suspicions were wrong. If she was right, her entire battalion could be wiped out in a matter of minutes. Or she could stay in position, disobey direct orders, and risk her career to potentially save hundreds of lives. Elena thought about Sarah Chun, about the friends she had lost over the years, about the young soldiers in the battalion who trusted their leaders to bring them home safely. She made her decision. Eagle Base, Raven's Nest. I'm staying in position for continued observation. We'll maintain radio silence unless contact is imminent. Before Martinez could respond, Elena switched off her radio and settled in for what might be the most important few hours of her military career. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Elena continued her surveillance of the valley. Through her scope, she began to see more evidence of enemy activity. Slight movements in the vegetation that could only be human. The occasional flash of equipment or weapons. Most damning of all, she spotted what appeared to be command wires running from the hillsides down to the road below. The entire area had been prepared as a kill zone, complete with remotely detonated explosives. Elena began to plan her next moves. She couldn't contact her battalion directly without revealing her disobedience, but she couldn't let them walk into certain death either. She needed to find a way to disrupt the ambush before the convoy arrived, and she needed to do it alone. The enemy positions were approximately 800 meters from her location, well within the effective range of her rifle but at the extreme edge for precision shots. She would have one opportunity to create chaos in the enemy ranks and hopefully scatter them before they could execute their plan. It wouldn't be easy, and the odds of success were slim, but it was the only chance her battalion had. As Elena began to calculate wind speed, humidity, and bullet drop for her shots, she heard the distant rumble of diesel engines echoing off the valley walls. The convoy was approaching, still invisible around the bend in the road, but getting closer every minute. She was running out of time to act. She selected her first target, an enemy soldier who appeared to be in a command position based on the radio antenna visible near his concealed position. If she could eliminate the enemy commander first, it might delay their coordinated attack long enough for the convoy to realize the danger and take evasive action. Elena controlled her breathing, feeling her heart rate slow as she entered the focused state that had made her one of the most effective snipers in her unit. Through her scope, the target's head filled the crosshairs. She made final adjustments for wind and distance, then slowly began to apply pressure to the trigger. The distant rumble of the convoy grew louder. In just a few more minutes, the first vehicles would round the bend and enter the kill zone. Elena knew that what happened in the next few seconds would determine whether her battalion survived the day or became casualties of war. She had no orders to engage, no official authorization for her actions. But she had something more important than orders. She had the absolute certainty that lives depended on her next shot. The crosshairs steadied on the target, and Elena held her breath as her finger found the trigger's breaking point. The convoy was almost in sight, the enemy was in position, and time had run out for everything except action. The rifle's recoil pressed against Elena's shoulder as the 7.62mm round left the barrel with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. Through her scope, she watched the enemy commander's head snap back as the bullet found its mark. The man dropped instantly, his radio equipment scattering as his body fell behind the concealed position. Immediately, chaos erupted on the hillside. Elena could see enemy soldiers scrambling from their hidden positions, confused and searching for the source of the shot. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they located her position and began returning fire. She needed to make every shot count. Her second target was an enemy soldier manning what appeared to be a heavy machine gun position. The weapon was perfectly positioned to rake the road with devastating fire once the convoy entered the valley. Elena adjusted her aim, compensated for the slight breeze that had picked up, and squeezed the trigger again. The machine gunner spun and fell, his weapon tilting awkwardly as his body collapsed across it. Elena was already moving to her next target before his body hit the ground. A third enemy soldier was frantically trying to operate the radio equipment left by the dead commander. Elena's third shot silenced him permanently. By now, the remaining enemy fighters had pinpointed her general location and were beginning to return fire. Bullets cracked overhead and struck the rocks around Elena's position, sending chips of stone flying. She rolled quickly to a new firing position several meters to her right, using the natural contours of the ridge to shield herself from incoming rounds. The sound of diesel engines was much closer now. Elena estimated that the lead vehicle of the convoy would be visible around the bend in less than 2 minutes. She had managed to eliminate the enemy commander and disrupt their coordinated attack plan, but there were still at least a dozen fighters in position to ambush the convoy. She needed to do more. Elena spotted an enemy soldier attempting to reach the detonation device for the roadside explosives. The command wires she had observed earlier led to what was obviously a substantial improvised explosive device, probably buried under the road surface where the convoy would be most vulnerable. She lined up her shot carefully and fired. The soldier jerked as the bullet struck him, but he didn't fall immediately. Instead, he stumbled toward the detonation device, apparently wounded but still determined to complete his mission. Elena cursed under her breath and fired again. This time the man dropped, rolling down the hillside away from the explosive controls. More enemy fire erupted from the hillsides, and Elena realized that despite her success in disrupting their initial plan, the enemy still had enough fighters to pose a serious threat to the convoy. She needed to get word to the battalion somehow, but turning on her radio would reveal her exact position to any enemy forces monitoring radio traffic. As bullets continued to crack around her position, Elena made a desperate decision. She would need to expose herself to enemy fire in order to signal the approaching convoy. Moving to a more exposed position on the ridge, she began firing deliberately at the enemy positions, hoping that the sound of her rifle would alert the convoy to the danger ahead. Her gambit worked, but not in the way she had expected. Instead of alerting the convoy, her sustained fire drew the attention of every enemy fighter in the valley. Suddenly, it seemed like the entire hillside was shooting at her position. Bullets whistled past her head, struck the rocks around her, and kicked up dirt clouds as they impacted the ground. Elena pressed herself flat against the rocky surface, feeling bits of shattered stone rain down on her back as enemy fire intensified. She was pinned down now, unable to move or return effective fire. Worse, she could hear the convoy getting closer every second. The lead vehicles would be entering the valley soon, and without their commander or coordinated plan, the enemy fighters were likely to open fire immediately rather than wait for the optimal moment. Just as Elena began to think her situation was hopeless, she heard a new sound echoing across the valley. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors was approaching from the south. Elena risked lifting her head slightly to peer toward the sound and felt a surge of hope. Two military helicopters were racing toward the valley, flying low and fast. The radio in her gear bag crackled to life, even though she had switched it off. Somehow, the signal was bleeding through. She could hear Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's voice, urgent and commanding. All units, this is Eagle Base. Be advised we have a friendly sniper in overwatch position engaging multiple enemy contacts in the valley. Inbound air support has visual on the situation. Convoy halt immediately and take defensive positions. Elena realized that her sustained firing had accomplished exactly what she had hoped. Someone in the convoy or back at base had recognized that the gunfire ahead wasn't random, but was coming from a single position engaging multiple targets. They had put together the pieces and called in air support. The helicopters swept over the valley with devastating effect. The enemy fighters, who had been so well concealed against ground observation, were completely exposed to aerial attack. Machine gun fire from the helicopters raked the hillsides, and Elena watched through her scope as enemy positions that had taken weeks to prepare were destroyed in minutes. One of the helicopters swooped low over Elena's position, and she could see the door gunner giving her a thumbs-up signal. The pilot's voice came over the radio. "Raven's Nest, this is Guardian Angel. Nice shooting down there. You definitely stirred up a hornet's nest." With air support suppressing the remaining enemy fighters, Elena was able to move to a better position and resume engaging targets. Her shots were more deliberate now, picking off any enemy fighters who tried to flee their destroyed positions. The combination of her precision rifle fire and the helicopter's area suppression was devastatingly effective. Within 20 minutes, the valley was secure. The enemy force that had spent months preparing an elaborate ambush had been completely neutralized. Elena counted at least 15 confirmed enemy casualties, with their weapons, equipment, and explosives captured or destroyed. As the helicopters established a protective patrol overhead, the convoy finally entered the valley. Elena watched through her scope as the vehicles rolled safely past the position where her battalion would have been massacred if the ambush had succeeded. The improvised explosive device was clearly visible now that the camouflage had been disturbed by the fighting. It was even larger than she had estimated, probably containing enough explosives to destroy several vehicles and kill dozens of soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's voice came over the radio again. Raven's Nest, this is Eagle Base. Return to convoy position immediately for debriefing. And Sergeant Vasquez. There was a pause. Outstanding work. Elena smiled grimly as she began to pack up her equipment. She had disobeyed direct orders, risked court-martial, and exposed herself to overwhelming enemy fire. But her instincts had been right, and her battalion was alive because she had trusted them. She had prevented a massacre that would have been one of the worst ambushes in recent military history. As she made her way down from the ridge toward the convoy, Elena reflected on the decisions she had made. Military discipline existed for good reasons, and soldiers who disobeyed orders put everyone at risk. But sometimes experience and instinct had to override strict adherence to orders. Sometimes a single soldier had to make a choice that could save or doom hundreds of others. The young soldiers in the convoy waved and cheered as Elena approached, many of them unaware of how close they had come to disaster. They saw only a successful mission and their safe return to base. Elena preferred it that way. The weight of command decisions was something that should be carried by those trained to bear it, not shared with every soldier in the unit. But as Elena climbed into one of the convoy vehicles for the ride back to base, she knew that this mission would stay with her for the rest of her life. She had trusted her instincts over her orders, and that trust had saved lives. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important decisions a soldier makes are the ones that go against everything they've been taught about following orders and maintaining discipline. The convoy's return to forward operating base Sentinel was unlike any Elena had experienced in her 23 years of service. Word of the thwarted ambush had spread quickly through military communications channels, and by the time their vehicles rolled through the main gate, it seemed like half the base personnel had gathered to witness their arrival. Elena sat quietly in the back of the transport vehicle, watching the celebration outside through the small window. She felt disconnected from the jubilant atmosphere. While everyone else saw a victory, she couldn't shake the image of how close they had come to catastrophe. The improvised explosive device alone could have killed 30 soldiers in the lead vehicles. The coordinated machine gun positions would have turned the narrow valley road into a killing field from which few would have emerged alive. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez was waiting for her as soon as the convoy stopped. His expression was unreadable as he approached her vehicle. "Sergeant Vasquez, report to my office immediately," he said tersely. "Bring your rifle and all equipment. We need to conduct a full debriefing of today's events." Elena gathered her gear and followed Martinez through the base, acutely aware of the stares and whispered conversations that followed her. Word had clearly spread about her unauthorized actions, and opinions among the troops seemed divided. Some saw her as a hero who had saved the battalion. Others viewed her as a rogue soldier who had dangerously undermined military discipline. Martinez's office was located in a prefabricated building at the center of the base. As Elena entered, she found several other officers already present, including Major Patricia Hawkins from Military Intelligence and Captain James Rodriguez, the battalion's operations officer. The atmosphere was formal and tense. "Sergeant Vasquez," Martinez began, settling behind his desk while the other officers remained standing. "What you did today raises serious questions about military discipline and the chain of command. You directly disobeyed a clear order to return to formation. You maintained radio silence despite repeated attempts to contact you. Most seriously, you engaged enemy forces without authorization from command." Elena stood at attention, her expression neutral. "Yes, sir, I understand the charges against me." "I'm not finished," Martinez continued, his voice growing harder. "Your actions today could have compromised the entire mission. You exposed yourself, and potentially the battalion, to enemy fire. You made tactical decisions that were not yours to make. In any other circumstances, I would have you court-martialed immediately." Major Hawkins stepped forward, a thick folder in her hands. "However, Sergeant Vasquez, the intelligence we've gathered from the ambush site tells a very different story. She opened the folder and spread several photographs across Martinez's desk. These images show one of the most sophisticated ambush preparations we've encountered in this theater of operations. Elena could see the photographs clearly from her position. They showed the enemy positions as they had been discovered after the fighting. The concealment was remarkable, fighting positions that were virtually invisible from ground level, carefully positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, and supply caches that indicated the enemy had been preparing for months. The explosive device you prevented from detonating, Captain Rodriguez added, pointing to another photograph, contained over 200 pounds of military-grade explosives. Our demolition experts estimate it could have destroyed every vehicle in the lead element of our convoy. Major Hawkins nodded grimly. Intelligence analysis indicates this ambush was planned as a major propaganda victory for enemy forces. The complete destruction of an American battalion would have been international news. It would have significantly impacted military operations throughout this region. Martinez leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. Sergeant Vasquez, your actions today undoubtedly saved lives. Potentially hundreds of lives. But they also represent a fundamental breach of military discipline that cannot be ignored. Elena felt the weight of conflicting emotions. Relief that her instincts had been validated, pride in the lives she had saved, but also genuine concern about the precedent her actions might set. Military discipline existed for crucial reasons, and soldiers who felt justified in ignoring orders could create chaos in any operation. Sir, Elena said carefully, I understand the seriousness of my actions. I knew when I made the decision to disobey orders that I was risking my career. But I also knew that if I was right about the ambush, following orders would result in the deaths of my fellow soldiers. Major Hawkins consulted her notes. Sergeant Vasquez, walk us through your decision-making process. What specifically made you believe the valley was compromised when our aerial reconnaissance showed no enemy activity? Elena took a deep breath and began to explain the subtle signs she had observed, the unnatural vegetation patterns, the disturbed earth around fighting positions, the glints of metal reflecting sunlight, and, most importantly, the complete absence of normal civilian activity in an area that should have been bustling with daily life. The birds stopped singing, Elena said. In my experience, wildlife goes silent when there are large numbers of people hidden in an area. The enemy force was probably 40 or 50 fighters, much larger than our initial intelligence suggested. Animals can sense that kind of presence even when humans can't detect it. Captain Rodriguez made notes as Elena spoke. The enemy casualties we've counted so far confirm your estimate. 43 enemy fighters were killed or wounded in the engagement. This was a significant enemy operation, not the small harassment action we had anticipated. Martinez stood and walked to the window overlooking the base. Sergeant Vasquez, in my 27 years of military service, I have never encountered a situation quite like this. Your disobedience of direct orders was inexcusable by any standard military justice manual. However, the results of your actions speak for themselves. He turned back to face Elena. I'm faced with a dilemma. If I prosecute you for disobeying orders, I send a message that soldiers should follow commands even when they believe those commands will result in disaster. If I don't prosecute you, I send a message that soldiers can ignore orders whenever they disagree with their superiors. Major Hawkins cleared her throat. Sir, if I may suggest an alternative approach, what Sergeant Vasquez demonstrated today wasn't simple disobedience. It was superior tactical judgment based on extensive combat experience. The question isn't whether she disobeyed orders, but whether we should have been listening to her concerns more carefully in the first place. Elena looked up in surprise. She hadn't expected any officer to defend her actions, particularly not someone from military intelligence. Major Hawkins is right, Captain Rodriguez added. Sergeant Vasquez tried to communicate her concerns through proper channels. She requested permission to remain in position for extended observation. When that was denied, she tried to report possible enemy positions. Her commanders dismissed these reports without adequate consideration. Martinez nodded slowly. The question becomes whether our command structure failed Sergeant Vasquez, or whether she failed her command structure. He paused, looking directly at Elena. Sergeant, if you found yourself in exactly the same situation again, would you make the same choices? Elena considered the question carefully. The honest answer could end her military career, but she had come too far to be anything less than truthful. Sir, if I believed my fellow soldiers were about to be killed, and no one would listen to my warnings, yes, I would make the same choice again. I became a soldier to protect people, not to follow orders that get people killed. The room fell silent for several long moments. Martinez returned to his seat and shuffled through the papers on his desk. Finally, he looked up at Elena with an expression that was part frustration, part admiration. Sergeant Vasquez, you put me in an impossible position today, but you also saved the lives of every soldier in this battalion. He paused, then continued, I'm not going to pursue disciplinary action against you. However, your actions today will be thoroughly documented and reviewed by higher command. They will decide whether your tactical judgment outweighs your breach of discipline. Elena felt a mixture of relief and continued anxiety. While she wouldn't face immediate court-martial, her career was still in jeopardy pending review by officers who hadn't been present during the crisis and might not understand the split-second decisions she had been forced to make. Major Hawkins gathered her photographs and files. Sergeant Vasquez, I want to debrief with you extensively over the next few days. The intelligence value of what you observed and the methods you used to identify enemy positions could be invaluable for training other soldiers. Your experience today may help prevent similar ambushes in the future. As the meeting concluded and Elena was dismissed, she walked out of the building with mixed feelings. She had saved her battalion, but at the cost of creating a precedent that could complicate military operations for years to come. Command structures existed for reasons, and soldiers who felt justified in ignoring orders could create dangerous situations. But as Elena walked across the base and saw the faces of soldiers who would be going home to their families because of her actions, she knew she had made the right choice. Sometimes, a single person had to stand up against the system, even when that system was designed to prevent exactly that kind of individual action. 3 weeks after the Valley incident, Elena sat in a sterile conference room at Regional Command Headquarters, 300 miles from Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The walls were lined with maps, communication equipment, and the stern photographs of senior commanders who would determine her fate. Outside the reinforced windows, she could see transport helicopters landing and taking off in a steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack of modern warfare. The review board consisted of 5 officers, ranging from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. Elena had been told this was standard procedure for any incident involving unauthorized engagement with enemy forces, but she suspected the high rank of the reviewing officers indicated the significance her case had achieved within the military command structure. Brigadier General Catherine Morrison, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, served as the board's president. She had spent the past 2 hours reviewing the incident from every possible angle, questioning Elena about her tactical decisions, her training, and the split-second judgments that had led to her disobedience of direct orders. Sergeant Vasquez, General Morrison said, consulting the thick file spread before her. In the 3 weeks since this incident, we have conducted extensive analysis of the enemy positions you identified and neutralized. The sophistication of their preparations suggests months of planning and significant resources. Intelligence estimates indicate this ambush was intended as a major strategic victory for enemy forces. Colonel James Patterson, the board's senior intelligence officer, leaned forward. The propaganda value of successfully ambushing an entire American battalion would have been immense. Video footage of destroyed vehicles and casualties would have been broadcast worldwide within hours. The psychological impact on both enemy morale and American public opinion could have been significant. Elena listened carefully, trying to gauge the direction of the review. The officers seemed to be emphasizing the strategic importance of preventing the ambush, which suggested they might be building a case to support her actions. But military justice was notoriously unpredictable, and she had learned not to assume anything about the outcome. However, General Morrison continued, her tone becoming more stern. We cannot ignore the fundamental issue of military discipline. You directly disobeyed orders from your commanding officer. You maintained radio silence despite repeated attempts to contact you. You engaged enemy forces without authorization. These actions represent serious breaches of military protocol. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Williams, the board's legal advisor, shuffled through several documents. Sergeant Vasquez, military law is quite clear regarding the consequences of disobeying direct orders during combat operations. Under normal circumstances, these charges could result in court-martial, reduction in rank, and possible imprisonment. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Despite the praise for preventing the ambush, it appeared the review board was prepared to prosecute her for her unauthorized actions. She had known this was a possibility, but hearing it stated so directly brought home the reality of her situation. But, General Morrison said, raising a hand to interrupt Elena's growing anxiety, these are not normal circumstances. The board has spent considerable time reviewing similar cases throughout military history. There are precedents for soldiers who achieved strategic success through tactical insubordination. Colonel Patterson opened another file. We've studied cases dating back to World War II, where individual soldiers made split-second decisions that contradicted their orders, but resulted in significant strategic advantages. In most cases, military leadership has recognized that rigid adherence to orders can sometimes conflict with the larger mission of protecting lives and achieving victory. Elena began to feel cautiously optimistic, but General Morrison's next words brought her back to reality. The challenge we face, Sergeant Vasquez, is balancing recognition of your tactical success against the need to maintain military discipline. If we excuse your actions entirely, we risk encouraging other soldiers to disobey orders whenever they disagree with their commanders. That path leads to chaos and the breakdown of effective command structure. Lieutenant Colonel Williams leaned back in her chair. We've also considered the alternative. If we prosecute you to the full extent of military law, we send a message that soldiers should follow orders even when they believe those orders will result in unnecessary casualties. That precedent could cost lives in future operations. The room fell silent as the officers considered their decision. Elena understood the complexity of their position. Military discipline was essential for effective operations, but blind obedience could also be dangerous. Her case had highlighted a fundamental tension in military command that had no easy resolution. General Morrison stood and walked to the large map covering one wall of the conference room. Sergeant Vasquez, your actions on that day undoubtedly saved lives. Our analysis indicates that without your intervention, the 2nd Infantry Battalion would have suffered catastrophic casualties. The enemy ambush was perfectly positioned and executed with near-professional precision. She turned back to face Elena. However, your methods raise serious questions about command authority and military discipline. We cannot simply ignore the fact that you disobeyed direct orders, regardless of the outcome. Colonel Patterson consulted his notes. The board has reached a decision that attempts to balance these competing concerns. You will receive an official reprimand for disobeying orders and maintaining unauthorized radio silence. This reprimand will become part of your permanent military record. Elena's heart sank. An official reprimand would effectively end any chance of further promotion and could impact her ability to serve in elite units or specialized roles. Her military career, which had been progressing steadily towards senior non-commissioned officer positions, was essentially over. However, General Morrison continued, you will also receive the Bronze Star Medal for valor in combat operations. Your tactical skill and courage in engaging a superior enemy force prevented what could have been one of the worst ambushes in recent military history. Elena felt confused by the contradictory decision. She was being simultaneously punished and rewarded for the same actions. The reprimand would damage her career, while the Bronze Star would recognize her heroism. It seemed like the board couldn't decide whether she was a hero or a criminal. Lieutenant Colonel Williams explained the reasoning behind the decision. This approach sends two clear messages. First, that disobeying orders has consequences, regardless of the outcome. Second, that tactical excellence and courage in protecting fellow soldiers will be recognized and rewarded. General Morrison returned to her seat. Sergeant Vasquez, we hope this decision will serve as guidance for future soldiers who may find themselves in similar situations. The lesson is not that soldiers should disobey orders, but that commanders must listen carefully to experienced personnel who express serious concerns about tactical situations. Colonel Patterson added, We're also recommending changes to standard operating procedures for reconnaissance and route clearance. Your observations about wildlife behavior, vegetation patterns, and other environmental indicators will be incorporated into training programs for scouts and advanced teams. Elena realized that while her career might be damaged, her experience was being used to potentially save other soldiers in similar situations. The lessons learned from her tactical decisions would be passed on to other units, possibly preventing future ambushes through better reconnaissance techniques. "Thank you, ma'am," Elena said, standing as the board prepared to conclude the session. "I understand the difficult position my actions created. I hope the changes you're implementing will help other soldiers make better decisions in similar circumstances." As Elena left the conference room, she reflected on the complex outcome of her review. She had saved her battalion, but damaged her own career in the process. She had been both punished and honored for the same actions. Most importantly, she had learned that doing the right thing sometimes required accepting personal consequences. 3 months later, Elena stood on a platform at Forward Operating Base Sentinel as General Morrison pinned the bronze star on her uniform. The ceremony was attended by every member of her battalion, including many soldiers whose lives had been saved by her unauthorized actions in the valley. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, who had initially been angry about her disobedience, spoke at the ceremony. "Sergeant Vasquez taught all of us an important lesson about the balance between military discipline and tactical judgment. Her courage in standing up for her convictions, even at great personal cost, embodies the best traditions of military service." As Elena looked out at the faces of her fellow soldiers, she knew that despite the damage to her career, she had made the right choice. The young faces in the crowd represented lives that had been saved by her willingness to trust her instincts over her orders. That knowledge would stay with her long after the controversy surrounding her actions had faded from memory. Elena's story became part of military training programs, used to teach soldiers about the complex relationship between orders and initiative, between discipline and independent thinking. Her experience in the valley demonstrated that sometimes a single soldier with the courage to act on her convictions could change the outcome of an entire operation. Years later, when Elena finally retired from military service, she was approached by young soldiers who had studied her case in training. They wanted to know how she had found the courage to disobey orders and risk everything to save her fellow soldiers. Elena's answer was always the same. "I didn't think about courage or orders or consequences. I just thought about the faces of the soldiers who were counting on me to bring them home safely." Sometimes, that's all the guidance you need.